Hello, my name is Julia Sloopsdown. I'm a PhD researcher at the Oxford Internet Institute and the Center for Doctoral Training in Cybersecurity. And today I am presenting my work on security through care, abusability insights from tech abuse at PEPR 21. So I will be covering broadly three things today. Firstly, the problem I'm trying to address, which is that gendered surveillance and technology abuse is often missed in many conventional cybersecurity threat models. Secondly, I'll overview the solution space, so the different approaches that I and others have taken to address this problem in the past. And lastly, I'm going to present some work in progress, which is an exploratory project interviewing tech abuse advocates to better understand their security and care practices, and presenting some insights or lessons for how the privacy engineering community can learn from these advocates and better support their work. So the problem which I want to address today can be illustrated through looking at a couple of papers doing security analysis on smart locks and kind of generally Internet of Things devices. So for example, the chart here displays an August smart lock system, which has a kind of Bluetooth enabled device, which attaches onto a conventional padlock. That device uses Bluetooth to connect to a smartphone app, which in turn uses Wi-Fi to connect to the August web servers. Please ignore the August Connect for now. And so a couple security analysis papers have done exploratory have explored what threats can compromise these systems. One crucial kind of element or feature of the August smart lock is it has two user types. One, which is an owner. The owners can lock and unlock the door. They can add or remove guests. They can view the user log. And then there's guests who can only lock and unlock the door and can't use any of those other features. And one of the security papers which I reviewed looks at the following kind of threat scenario. So Alice and Bob, who are presumably cohabitating and also presumably in a relationship. And Alice gives Bob owner level access. So they are now both owners. Alice gets out of Bluetooth range of the lock. At this point, Bob presumably becomes a malicious actor. So I think we can assume they break up. Because Bob maliciously puts his phone in airplane mode, preventing it from communicating with the August servers, but leaving Bluetooth enabled. Alice revokes Bob's access, so he, in theory, should no longer have access to the home. But because Bob's phone can't connect to the August servers, the Bluetooth device doesn't register this, and so Bob can still enter and exit the house. And also, due to an error in the system, in this period before Alice gets back into Bluetooth range of the lock, the system won't register Bob entering and exiting. Now, in the context of domestic violence, this seems to me like a really serious threat. So this means that someone who could pose like a psychological, emotional, or physical threat to people in the household can now enter and exit. But the paper describes this as alarming in theory, but unlikely to be a problem in practice, because owners can revoke each other's access by definition. And if Bob were truly malicious, he could have revoked Alice's access after he was granted owner status. For this reason, the original owner should not give owner status to anyone she does not trust immensely. So a couple of problems here. Trust here is being treated as the static feature, which doesn't change over time. So you should be able to tell if someone's truly malicious at the beginning, which obviously doesn't resemble the way relationships actually work. It's being, I think, broadly dismissive of quite a serious security problem. And lastly, there is an element of victim blaming here, which is kind of blaming Alice for giving owner status to someone. Again, with this idea that like if you trust them immensely, then they won't be a problem later on, which we know isn't the case. So Starting with these few papers looking at smart locks, I did a broader review of over 50 papers in the Internet of Things security analysis space, and found that in most cases, these papers don't even consider someone from inside of the home as an attacker. So predominantly they look at remote network-based attackers, which are essentially like hackers, someone far away, burglars, thieves, arsonists. Where they do consider insiders, it's insiders to the company rather than insiders to the home. And so there's this systematic assumption that the owner of the device, someone within the home, is not a threat. So the paper, which I described in the past and was critical of, although it is dismissive of this threat model, is actually quite an exception in that it even considers it. Because broadly, these forms of technology-enabled abuse, like sexual abuse, like domestic violence, threats which are, according to feminist critics of security studies, gendered, because although they can and do happen to everyone, they are disproportionately committed by men and disproportionately affect women, with other compounding factors according to class, race, and disability, and so forth. And broadly, what I'm suggesting is that this isn't an isolated incidence of one paper being dismissive, but rather threat modeling as a whole doesn't consider these threats, or conventionally didn't consider these threats. So for example, if you ask people in cybersecurity, as I did at the beginning of my PhD, sort of fellow students, professors, whether image-based sexual abuse or revenge porn is a cybersecurity issue, they'll often say, no, it's a privacy issue and therefore not within the scope of security, or just be confused or again, sometimes dismissive. So this is an argument I developed further in my paper, which is highlighted here, titled Safe at Home, towards a feminist critique of cybersecurity, which draws on feminist critiques of security studies. Now, a response that people who are looking at technology abuse sometimes get is that this is an edge case. So this is something that's extremely rare, which unfortunately isn't the case. So we know that in countries, including the UK, domestic abuse makes up a really significant proportion of violent crime. And on top of that, is also commonly underrecorded because people are often very unwilling to report these kinds of crimes to the police compared to other forms of crime. And as this data from Refuge shows, increasingly technology is abused as a part of broader patterns of behavior. So many domestic violence cases, sexual abuse cases will include technology and technology abuse in some form. Before I move on, I wanted to give a shout out to this meme created by lebak.dev, which managed to summarize in one meme what I spent a paper developing, which is a man picking up a phone, asking for a wake-up call, and the answering wake-up call is InfoSec's obsession with nation-state hacking is at the expense of more common intrusions by abusers. So, moving on to the solution space. Although, as I've said, conventional threat modeling often excludes domestic violence and intimate partner violence, there is a really important and kind of vibrant emerging research area looking at this. So for example, at Cornell, the IPV Tech research team has published a few really excellent papers on this, and also has a clinic and tech abuse, which is very well documented in their papers in terms of an initiative to support survivors with volunteer technologists. At UCL, there's the Gender and IoT Lab with Leonie Tancher. Karen Levy and Bruce Schneier have published an excellent paper titled Privacy Threats in Intimate Relationships. Quite a few researchers from violence and criminology studies have looked at this. And there's also a great initiative from Eva Galperin and the Coalition Against Stalkerware, which has attempted, successfully convinced many antivirus software companies to include the kind of spyware that's often used in intimate relationships in their products. Now, the first reflex for many in the privacy and security space when finding out about technology abuse is to create kind of more advanced privacy and security advice for survivors. And while these kind of digital self-defense guides are incredibly important and really valuable, they do risk creating what Harris and Woodlock have called safety work. So as many people in the domestic violence space have documented, survivors who are often incredibly financially, kind of emotionally, cognitively burdened by their abuse, then have to take on really complex technology practices, sort of securing their devices, checking and updating all of their privacy settings. And that kind of unfairly shifts the burden for solving this problem onto people who are already being victimized. So an alternative school of thought tries to develop our knowledge about tech abuse into safety by design practices. So for example, the concept of abusability introduced by Ashkan Soltani argues that tech companies need to be thinking not just about security, so how a device can be compromised externally, but also abusability, so how a device can be abused even if it's being used broadly in the way that its designers intended, and kind of mitigate for those practices. This is something that's developed by an IBM team on design principles for coercive control resistant design. And also something I've worked on with Leonie Tancher in a paper on an IPv threat model, where we adapt some of Adam Shostak's threat modeling questions, which you may be familiar with, to the specific problem of tech abuse, which is coming in a forthcoming paper, and I won't go into depth now for time purposes. So actually, you know what? I'm doing good for time. Let me go back to this quickly. So in adapting these questions, we focused specifically on, for example, the kind of features like location tracking, which can be co-opted for abuse, and how designers sort of can, in practice, connect these to common vectors of compromise in these scenarios. And also thinking about practices that can mitigate this, and thinking about how to monitor products for abuse to validate those threat models. Okay, moving on finally to the case study that I wanted to present today. So I'm doing kind of more sociological research on tech abuse advocates who are currently working from a variety of areas to support survivors of tech abuse. So just a quick slide to shout out just a couple of the organizations that are doing really great work in this space. So for example, in the UK, Refuge, which has a whole network of domestic violence shelters, has been doing really great work on tech abuse. Newer organizations like Chain or Glitch focus specifically on online abuse, as well as NTAB with Adam Dodge, or Not Your Porn, which is a campaign about image-based sexual abuse. The National Network to End Domestic Violence in the US, WESNET in Australia, Atina in Serbia. And to clarify, those are not necessarily organizations that participated in this study. What I'm about to present does not necessarily represent any of the views of those organizations, but I just wanted to give them a shout out in case you are looking to support some of those organizations or their work, or if you want to find out more about them. So what I did in this study, which is, for clarification, a work in progress, is 26 qualitative interviews with tech abuse advocates, the majority of whom came from the domestic violence space, so sort of working in shelters or as advocates, but also in human trafficking and sexual violence, as well as some people who started out in the digital privacy space or in software engineering from like hacking collectives, or just as advocates who are privacy advocates. And I think the first sort of lesson from this study is challenging commonly assumed ideas of tech expertise. So a lot of these people, and particularly coming from the domestic violence space, predominantly women, wouldn't commonly be described as cybersecurity experts. But I think because they are working at the front lines of how technology can go wrong in some of the worst ways possible on a daily basis, they do actually have a really valuable sort of lived experience and lived technology expertise. And this kind of technology expertise can unfortunately be taken for granted in broadly the technology space. So for example, one advocate described situations in which advocates are asked to give feedback on products that companies have developed with very little compensation or no compensation. And the kind of going assumption there is that they should be grateful that the company is even taking an interest in this or doing something to help survivors. Where if you think about a kind of analogous example of a malware analyst, if somebody asked a malware analyst to give feedback on a new antivirus product simply because they care so much about fighting malware, that would be preposterous. And so I think one really important takeaway is that we need to value and compensate the expertise that tech abuse advocates are developing in their work supporting survivors. And in terms of what that might look like in practice, here is a kind of indicative set of recommendations on the basis of this study. So firstly, a really interesting thing that advocates are doing is developing digital security beyond technical security, building up sort of networks of care in their communities for people that survivors can turn to. So for example, quite a few of them have reached out to local mechanics to make sure that mechanics understand the situation that domestic violence survivors might find themselves in and are therefore prepared to like help someone scan their car for a tracking device and don't respond in a way that's kind of that might undermine victims' experiences. And doing similar things with say tech support staff at a Best Buy in the US or with the police, or to some extent with the tech industry at large, kind of raising awareness of the specific dynamics of technology abuse, the specific problems survivors face, and making sure that people don't react in ways that are invalidating, treating survivors like they're crazy, which unfortunately is still too commonly a response from, for example, law enforcement. And some of the ways that this can be implemented come under the kind of label of trauma-informed design. So trauma-informed approaches are something that's often taken forward in domestic violence spaces or other service delivery spaces. The assumption being that because you don't know if you're dealing with someone, if you're providing services to someone who's experienced trauma, you should design all of your services in a way that takes that experience into account and is sensitive to that experience. So some of the ways this can be implemented is providing much better customer support. So one thing that many advocates pointed out is that it's basically impossible, even if you're experiencing really serious harassment or stalking, to get anyone on the line in these companies. And I think increasingly what I think broadly the privacy and security community needs to recognize is that there's a specific user type that faces intimate surveillance or the risk of account compromise from people within their intimate sphere who are particularly at risk as a result of that. And so they may need additional support. They may need specialized verification processes, for example, using their, using a government issued ID to prove their identity if their account has been stolen. Or they may need support in getting evidence of abuse to provide that evidence to courts. So for example, one of the advocates I spoke with is essentially spending an increasing amount of her time guiding survivors through Facebook's processes for removing intimate images which have been posted without consent. So essentially performing a kind of unpaid customer support role for Facebook. But what she's found is that the moment that those photos are removed by Facebook, which can take weeks, it's also impossible to get any evidence that they were there in the first place. So if you don't screenshot it before it's taken down, there's no kind of support for providing evidence in court. There's a lot of design practices that can better incorporate consent. like regular reminders if your location is being tracked or if your data is being shared with another user. And it's also good to be mindful of the risks of re-traumatization with creepy design. So for example, targeted advertising, which seems like it's watching users or following users, can be particularly distressing for people who've experienced stalking. And I think that's something that isn't being taken into consideration with those kinds of designs. Lastly, because every kind of device is different, every product is different, and every situation of abuse is different, it's really difficult to give one size fits all design recommendations. And so I would say, as much as possible, it's important to partner with tech abuse advocates and survivors when putting out technology into the world that can be used to abuse people, and to compensate them adequately for their time and expertise in security and privacy. So thank you very much for listening. I look forward to hearing your questions. Please feel free to email me at julia.slupska@cybersecurity.ox.ac.uk or at jslips on Twitter. And I look forward to hearing your questions.